students. Today we are going to talk about Kabir's syncretism in Bijak, his ideas on economic inequalities, livelihood and property. This unit would enable the students to understand Kabir's life, his teaching, the influence of Bhakti tradition on Kabir, his thoughts on economic inequalities of his time, his views on livelihood, his principles of syncretism, and the relevance of his work to contemporary times. To begin with, India is a land of great poets and philosophers whose thoughts and philosophies have inspired people across continents and contributed to understanding true ideals of human life. Sant Kabir was one such great poet. He was an eminent thinker, a great activist, and a mystic poet who urged people to recognize human values by ignoring divisions in society that are created in the name of religion and caste. Kabir's ideals were quite secular. His thoughts on religion and caste, particularly his emphasis on human values, is something that is worth remembering in these troubled times of uncertainty, strife and chaos. When human beings are divided in the name of caste, color, religion and gender, Kabir devoted his life to preaching equality, dignity and self-respect, justice to all people who were blinded by the irrational practices of different religions. Now we come to the life of Kabir. Kabir's life abounds in legend. Born in the late 14th century, when Delhi and the entire North India became weak due to unending struggle between the Hindus and the Muslims, what was needed was an alternative, orientation to spiritual thinking. Then came the Bhakti movement with Mirabai, Surdas, Raidas and others. It is said that Kabir was the product of the Bhakti movement. He lived and flourished in Banaras. Most scholars agree with the Kabir Panthis that Nehru, a weaver, and his wife Nima found the infant Kabir on a lotus leaf in Leheteng in Banaras. Nehru and Nima were Julaha or Muslim weavers who lived on the outskirts of Kashi. As a weaver, he was one of the untouchables, the lowest caste in Hindu society, along with other artisans such as potters, cobblers, dyers, etc. As far as the stories of the Hindus go, Kabir was the illegitimate son of a Brahmin widow. Muslims, on the other hand, believe that Kabir was a child of the Muslim parents. The theory of his immaculate birth has been rejected by most scholars. Kabir himself declares, "I am neither a Hindu nor a Mussalman." A disciple of great Hindu preacher Pandit and philosopher reformer Saint Ramananda, he was the focal point of Bhakti movement and was steeped in Hindu philosophy and obscure practices. "I am the child of Allah and Ram," he said. About Kabir, Swami Siddhananda writes, Kabir was born in 1440 AD. The probable death of Kabir was dated at 1519 AD, as mentioned in Kabir Ki Shanti. According to legends, Kabir was a disciple of great Namananda, the sage of Banaras at that time. He was a staunch devotee of the Vaishnavite school of Hindu religion. He was a great saint and a philosopher of his time. Ramananda was orthodox and a great religious leader. He would not look at the untouchables and would not entertain any low caste to become his disciple. Kabir was a Muslim of no standing in front of him. So, it was almost impossible for Kabir to gain his discipleship. But Kabir was so enamored of him from his early age. Once, in the pre-dawn twilight, when Ramananda used to take bath at the Ganga, Kabir lay down at the steps of the river Ghat, and the sage, without knowing, or seeing stepped over him, hitting his head by his foot. Startled, he uttered, "Ram, Ram." At this, Kabir silently got up and declared that he was the disciple of great Ramananda. He asked why Kabir made such a false claim as to be his disciple. Kabir replied, "Sir, I was initiated on the steps of the ghat. You touched my forehead with your foot and gave me the mantra, Ram, Ram." Through his guru, Kabir is said to have attained enlightenment at the age of 20. Now we begin with the teachings of Kabir. Kabir's work hinted at the fact that he was a true devotee of nonconformity, of all that is free, noble and challenging in the Indian tradition. The doctrines of Bhakti were professed by Ramananda, but it was propagated by Kabir and his followers. Kabir was a Vaishnavite. He was deeply influenced by the Nirguna school and held high faith and respect for the truth beyond worldly affairs. He described his God as Nirguna. He tried to establish the superiority of Bhakti as the path to achieve supreme being. According to him, the earliest way to get close to realizing the truth about God is Bhakti. It is the largest sentiment, the highest respect and love for God. Kabir's God is absolutely impersonal. Kabir did not believe in the idea of reincarnation or personal God. He believed in the impersonal God. In simple words, Kabir wanted to reform the society through the religion of Bhakti, which may be acceptable for all people of diverse faiths. And in this regard, Kabir's concept of Bhakti is very important and relevant in our present day society. Kabir is perhaps one of the most outstanding examples of a poet saint who emerged within the context of social disturbances. Historians have painstakingly tried to reconstruct his life and times through a study of compositions attributed to him. Such exercises have proved to be challenging on a number of counts. The most important being, Kabir was not literate, and therefore whatever he learnt through hearing. Verses ascribed to Kabir have been accumulated by his followers and compiled in three distinct and overlapping traditions. The Kabir's Bijak is preserved by the Kabir Panthis in Varanasi and elsewhere in Uttar Pradesh. The Kabir Granthawali is associated with Dadu Panth in Rajasthan, and many of his compositions are found in Adi Granth Sahib. All these manuscripts compilation were made long after Kabir's death. Kabir's poems and songs have survived in several languages and dialects, and some are composed in the distinct language of Nirguna poets, the Sant Bhasha. Others, such as Ulta Bhashi, upside down saying, are written in a form in which everyday meanings are reversed. These hint at the difficulties of capturing the nature of the ultimate reality in words. Expressions such as the lotus which blooms without flower or the fire raging in the ocean convey a sense of Kabir's spiritual and mystic experiences. Kabir could not close his eyes against the rampant form of enslavement the human beings of the society of his time was aggrieved with. There were bondages of understanding like ritualism, fundamentalism, fanatism and communalism. Discrimination based on caste, class, sect, social status, profession, language, religion, etc. was the most commonly found social anomalies. Kabir attempted a campaign of reformation with a view to freeing the humans from the clutches of diverse bondages. Now we come to the influence of the Bhakti tradition on Kabir. Bhakti, according to many scholars, is the democratic doctrine which consolidates all people without distinction of caste, community, nationality or sex. Among the Bhakti movement, the Hindu Bhakti movement makes a distinction between Nirguna and Shaguna, Vaishnavite and Sant tradition. And within the Sant tradition, there are glaring differences which are observable. The more liberal Bhakti has for its entire corpus an identifiable God, God who is just and one for all, who makes no discrepancies. Such liberal Bhakti poets themselves identify with the agony, pain and sufferings of the commoners. They were not social reformers or revolutionaries, but nonetheless, through their unorthodox voices and protestations against social ills of their times, they lashed out at the institutions that stood in the way of human progress, and Kabir clearly belonged to that tradition. He stood as an antagonist of caste system and evil practices that prevailed in the society of his time. He stressed that in God's creation, all were equal. He advised his followers to give up such inhuman practices as untouchability, feelings of high, low, etc. He further opposed the worship of stone images or even the worship of different gods and goddesses, and was against rituals and ceremonies in religion that is paramount in Hindu religion. Kabir's religious faith, which is rooted in his personal spiritual experiences, does not arise out of any formally fixed ideology or doctrine of Bhakti. Kabir's Nirgula school constitutes a distinct Bhakti tradition with its strong emphasis on the idea of an impersonal God, the evidence of Advaita philosophy and yoga in it, and its emphasis on self-knowledge and reasoning do not detract from its vital character of Bhakti. Therefore, for Bhakti to be one of the most important element in Kabir's teachings and his various poets and couplets, he determined the path of passive surrender, but for him, Bhakti is a laborious process requiring self-knowledge and courage and a constant effort towards self-realization. According to him, only the brave and valiant can tread the path of Bhakti. Those who are devoid of courage are unable to cope with it. Only the one who is able to stand firmly on it can liberate and safely thread its path. Mounted on the steed of love with the sword of knowledge in his hand, the devotee can conquer death. Now we come to Kabir's syncretic principles. The entry of Kabir into Bhakti movement proved most fruitful in bringing about reconciliation between the Hindu and the Muslim traditions. With familial attachment to both the religious communities, Kabir was free from religious prejudice against either. He followed the path of mysticism, the Bhakti and the Sufi tradition. Though notoriously religious in outlook, he was not a slave of either Hinduism or Muslim. He was a man of absolute independent thought and broadly criticized the evils of both the religions. Kabir addressed mixed gatherings consisting of Muslims and Hindus and had the ability to make disciples from both. He denounced the Brahmins and the mullahs alike for their arrogance, as they believed themselves to be the sole custodians of their religious order, and took them to task for their orthodox and exploitative attitude. He refused to accept the sanctity of the Vedas as well as the Quran to be the revealed scriptures. He declared categorically that only the self of man could free him from the cycle of death and life, and not the artificial ceremonies of prayers in temples and mosques. He said that, "Tell your beads, paint your forehead with the mark of your God, and wear matted locks, long and showy. But a deadly weapon is in your heart, and how shall you have God?" With this we come to the economic inequalities that he talked about, that he directly preached against during his time. Kabir was not methodologically educated, but had wise understanding about social reality and was a revolutionary. His thinking was practical as well as radical. He was a saint, a poet, a mystic, and a great thinker and a social reformer. He was a man of the people and spoke the dialect that was common to all. He moved with them, taught them, lived with them, and therefore understood their plight. Weaving was his profession, and weaving the human society into a well-knit human network in all its facets was his life's mission. He was against the caste system that plagued Hindu society. He fervently urged men to do away with all inequalities in the society that divides men and also causes enormous social inequalities and social hardship for people belonging to lower caste. Kabir attacked the feudal class of his time, landlords belonging to the nobility, which beheld the traditional elitist structures. Both Hindus and Muslims were part of that elite structure and fostered the system of exploitation. Kabir realized that it was this well-off people that were responsible for the sufferings and misery of the poor. Religious victimization by elite did occur, but the economic position of the victims pulled them back to their class. Since majority of the population was rural and was associated with agriculture, they were also a source of surplus exploitation and extraction. They converted the society into a hell by oppressing the poor people in all possible way. He also criticized the commercial class because they were misusing their money by lending it to the poor at a higher interest rate. The poor, being usually unable to repay, falls into the trap of the moneylenders as they usurp their land and houses to get their money back. Apart from inequality, intolerance, arrogance, and attachment to worldly objects, Kabir traced the major cause of human problem to lust. Men's lust for money, power, name, fame, and sex is a root cause of all sorrows. The message espoused by Kabir to reorganize society, which was scattered by discriminatory behavior, was the ideal of equality. Different standards were applied to individuals and communities: superior, inferior, high, low, etc. The approach of Kabir to this mentality of inequality and discrimination was basically spiritual. He preached that contemplating the whole reality would help one rise beyond the fragmented mind. A non-dualistic experience is the basic requirement for equality. It is the divided mind which discriminates on the basis of caste, color, profession, language, religion, creed, faith, etc. The foundation of human equality is faith in divinity. This ascetic outlook to life is the spiritual motivation of equality. His political utopia, the Begumpura, the kingdom of God, was the reflection of his consciousness, his unorthodox ideas. It was an ideal village society without any sorrow, private property, taxes, monarchy, social hierarchy, or economic discrimination. It was a land of saintly people without any fear, greed, impulse, crime and scarcity. It was a rational and human society. It meant the sovereignty of the citizens and equality among them, which translates into freedom for all. Now we come to his views on livelihood. According to Kabir, every individual is to live an honest life. One should be an honest bread earner and householder, just as a lotus flower survives with unblemished character in the midst of muddy water. Kabir, through his songs and dohas, strongly represented the voice of the indigenously budding modernity in Indian society, which was long brewing owing to the revival of trade, creation and spread of multi-hued artisanal class, and the accelerated process of modernization and urbanization since the 10th century CE. The exercise of critical reason in matters of caste and conventional religious practices were necessitated by the rising self-confidence of the emerging new classes. Kabir was a great opponent of the caste system. He stressed that in God's creation, all were equal. He opposed the worship of stone idols or even the worship of different gods and goddesses, and was against every kind of religious rituals and practices. Kabir, through his poems and couplets, contributed to the development of a long-standing tradition of argumentation, dialogue and debate in the philosophical spiritual sphere that in turn created a public space which was essentially Indian in nature. Now we come to the relevance of his work to contemporary times. Kabir was strictly against the practice of hypocrisy and did not like people maintaining double standards. He always preached people to be compassionate towards other living beings and practice true love, which is somewhat missing in present days. He urged the need to have good company of the people, those who adhere to values and principles. He emphasized that love was the only medium which could bind the entire humankind in an unbreakable bond of fraternity. He advised all to give up hatred and spread love for one and all. Today's world is bogged down by excessive materialism. The deep-seated economic inequalities of the world are leading to a simmering discontent across the world. Kabir's principle of compassionate ethics are relevant. Corruption is deep-seated problem in India which is eating away the vitals of the nation, inside out. The emphasis on honest living by Kabir, if understood in the right spirit, will provide a way of changing the individual's perspective. Communalism, again, is a lurking problem in the Indian social context. The essentials of syncretism and universalism, which are part of Kabir's work, can help in solving these issues to a certain extent. Kabir's couplets, thus, was counter-hegemonic, challenged the established socio-political order, and was anti-authority and subversive. It was an alternative politics through the composite narrative that laid the ideological base for the future acts of resistance against domination. To conclude with, Kabir was one such great mystic poet and social reformer who enriched the human society by his struggle against various forms of disharmony in the society, that is, discrimination, slavery, corruption, casteism, and other abnormalities. He not only expounded the spirit of religion but also lived it. His main concern was to establish an egalitarian society based on equality. Kabir became a symbol of subversion and of opposition, that a parallel subaltern tradition of couplets and dohas emerged in the name of Kabir, which constantly challenged the ideological dominance of the elite, and it was very much secular in nature. It was also sarcasm, allegorical, and euphemism, but it was rational in a deceptive manner that exposed the property relation and its dominance. An initiation into Kabir's ideas gave people self-confidence, freed men from the bondage of subjugation in terms of ideas, and transcended people from religious caste identity to a secular one. Thank you.